Hello, everyone. You've reached Lecture 4, The Othering of Native and Asian Americans. This lecture will be completed by Sunday, June 19th. Although most of our experiences as school children probably vary widely, if you grew up in the United States, you probably heard at one point or another the following verse. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And on every second Monday in October, Americans celebrate the holiday named for the European explorer who allegedly discovered America. Yet, as critical scholars of race and ethnicity and diversity, we know that this is a deeply problematic and fraudulent account. For one thing, Christopher Columbus did not discover America, but stumbled onto the Western Hemisphere's landmass in his search for a trade route between Europe and India. And as for the indigenous peoples of the Americas who were encountered and subsequently wiped out by Columbus and his followers, they already knew who they were and did not need to be discovered or named. Yet America was named for the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci, and in the centuries that followed, indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere were slaughtered and enslaved when they failed to assimilate to European demands. Following Columbus's discovery, or put more accurately, the Eurocentric account of Columbus's discovery, the American colonies needed to define what it meant to be American. White settlers did this through othering, the process of a dominant culture ascribing an undesirable trait, one shared by all humans, onto one specific group of people. Othering relies on the psychological concept of displacement, in which a person or group sees something about itself that it does not like, and instead of accepting that fault or shortcoming, it projects it onto another group or person. Throughout U.S. history, fear and hysteria about uncivilized and unlearned cultures not belonging to European descent has been used to justify institutional violence and discrimination against non-white people. In today's lecture on Native American and Asian cultural identities and representation, we will look at the ways in which the processes of othering by European American settlers have become manifested in visual culture, reinforcing stereotypes and ideological assumptions that had already been circulating for generations but were reinvigorated through the power of the visual image. Soon after Columbus and other explorers returned to Europe, accounts of Native Americans proliferated and were broadly categorized into the following two categories. The first was the noble savage, primitive and childlike rather than threatening or violent. According to this stereotype, Native Americans, lacking in European customs and intellect, allegedly maintained pure instincts about nature and the world around them. These spiritual links to the natural world gave the noble savage a certain level of nobility in the Eurocentric imagination. The second view was the bloodthirsty savage, a violent and aggressive being who was bent on destroying innocent white settlers and kidnapping and raping white women. While the imagery of the noble savage and the bloodthirsty savage may seem like polar opposites, both broadly conceived of indigenous Americans as barely one step above animals, guided by instinct and raw impulse rather than complex thought, and perhaps most crucially, devoid of their own cultural traditions and civilizations. These simplistic and demeaning binaries served as rallying cries for the expansion westward of European settlers, later articulated in the mid-19th century as Manifest Destiny, which essentially espoused the ideology that it was the God-given right of white settlers to tame the Wild West through democracy and Christianity. Despite their presence long before European settlers arrived, it was not until 1924 that the United States officially granted Native American citizenship. It was beginning in the 1920s also when motion picture portrayals of Native Americans multiplied rapidly during the golden age of the Western. Now, like black characters, Native Americans were often played by white actors wearing red face makeup and belonging not to a single historically accurate tribe, but a stereotypical composite drawing from visual traits from a variety of native cultures. And once again, these images reiterated the two most basic visual motifs of the American Indian, either the bloodthirsty savage who fought against white encroachment and unremitting determination, usually in Westerns these were the Sioux or the Apache tribes, or the simplistic, friendly, noble savage who fought alongside the Caucasian Western hero like the Lone Ranger, as a typical, loyal, subservient sidekick. Even action sequences, such as this one from John Ford's Stagecoach, considered by many to be one of the first truly great Hollywood westerns, provides a real useful metaphor for the marginalization of Native characters. The film positions the spectator to view the attack from the perspective of the white travelers. The white characters' various reactions to the battle are individuated, while the Indians are kept in long shot, figured as one large fighting mass. And while the Indians are unambiguously constructed as threatening, white superiority is always crucially maintained. By the 1960s and 70s, however, Native American culture went through a fairly significant transformation. The American Indian movement, led by Russell Means, paralleled the aims of the civil rights movement for equal rights as well as equitable media representation of Native Americans. The war in Vietnam sensitized younger white Americans of the countercultural movement to issues of U.S. imperialism and warfare against non-whites. And as a result, the traditional Western hero, once embodied by John Wayne, was decried as far more bloodthirsty and savage-like than any Indian, while the burgeoning environmentalist movement upheld native cultures as exemplars of ecological harmony between humans and the earth. And while this new awareness of and respect for Native American cultures challenged lingering stereotypes, Hollywood's formula for othering was still at work within many of these media, complicating their messages of cultural respect. In many films and TV series within the last 50 years, even including Academy Award-winning films like Dances with Wolves and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the Indian experience is still refracted through the eyes of white people. Now, fortunately, in 1998, Smoke Signals, which is your assigned film for Thursday, was released. Advertised as the first feature film written, directed, and produced by Native Americans, Smoke Signals depicts two complex, articulate, and fully developed Native characters, Victor and Thomas. Now, both characters engage in conversations and situations which raise and gently deconstruct stereotypical ideas about Native Americans, some of which had actually been internalized by many Native Americans themselves. U.S. portrayal of Asian characters bears some similarities with Native Americans, namely through the Eurocentric practice of branding Asians as the other. And like the noble savage, Europeans depicted Asia and Asians as a mysterious outwardly placed, born not of supposedly superior Western intellect, but Eastern mysticism and spirituality. These constructions consist of what scholar Edward Said in the 1970s described as Orientalism. That is, the way that white cultures have historically imagined the idea of Asia and Asian cultural identity, rather than considering the actual geographic region or cultures. Now, it's because Orientalism essentialized the many different cultures and civilizations of Eastern Asia into one stereotyped and reductive grouping that the term Oriental is considered offensive today. We use Asian American as a replacement. But like stereotyped historical discourses of Native American cultures, Asians and Asian Americans were conceived of by whites as exotic, meek, and lawless, primarily in order to justify imperial domination and subordination by American colonial forces. Now, Orientalism and the cultural construction of Asian identity does deviate from Native American representation in a few very specific historical contexts, however. For one thing, Chinese immigrants were excluded from entering the United States in the late 19th century, while American citizens of Japanese descent were rounded up into internment camps along the Pacific coast during World War II. Now, during Hollywood's classical era, Asians were characterized through what was commonly known as the yellow peril image.
For this one, Father, I would suggest a slower death.
As with other active campaigns of othering by whites, yellow peril imagery was the byproduct of racist, anti-immigrant, and xenophobic sentiments, casting Asian characters as sinister and violent. Like blacks and Latinos, Asian men were portrayed as gangsters and rapists with appetites for white women, while some specific recurring villains, such as the diabolical Dr. Fu Manchu, who you saw a second ago, undermined white society through superior intellect and mysterious and untrustworthy behavior. Asian women, like the one you see here, were cast as either hapless geisha girls designed to serve the sexual fantasies of white men, or dragon ladies, a spy or criminal mastermind who used her sexual wiles to entrap unsuspecting white heroes. Now, such stark yellow peril imagery, like the one you just saw there, it was crucial because it implied that Asians in America were explicitly not interested in assimilating to the American way, thus constructing them as opposing cultural acceptance and the kind of friendly cultural interfacing that many white Americans publicly insisted they believed in while privately opposing them at all costs. But like Native Americans, the media's portrayal of Asian Americans shifted by the 1960s. In 1966, sociologist William Peterson observed that many Asian Americans, and especially Japanese Americans, had overcome the adversity of cultural discrimination and economic disadvantage through family structure and a cultural emphasis on hard work. Now, Peterson theorized that these essentialized traits made Japanese Americans and Asian Americans in general a model minority. This model minority label was backed up by U.S. Census data, which increasingly showed that Asian Americans had routinely higher levels of household income and educational attendance, while having lower levels of crime, drug use, and imprisonment. Now, these statistics were embodied in U.S. media, which portrayed Asian American youth especially as whiz kids, graduating with the highest grade point averages possible and behaving in stereotypically nerdy and often asexual ways. However, even stereotypes espousing positive traits such as hard work and determination can still undermine the reality of diversity in America. Now, besides essentializing all Asian cultures into a single hardworking, determined, economically privileged cultural grouping, the model minority myth has been used to undermine the efforts to increase visibility of Black, Latino, and Native American communities. So, in other words, it's kind of like the logic of if they can do it, why can't you? Furthermore, the model minority myth uses an essentially racist framework to suggest that Asian Americans are gifted with an inherent propensity for cultural success, while other racial and ethnic minorities are somehow lacking or are just simply inferior. Now, Friday's film, Better Luck Tomorrow, directed by Justin Lin, examines a group of high-achieving Asian American teenagers that, upon first glance, they would seem to reinforce the model minority stereotype. But when you look at the film more deeply and you kind of see the vicious circles that they are a part of, it really illustrates how the model minority label ignores deeper intersectional issues within Asian American communities. That is all for today's lecture. I will see you later in the week.